This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
Wow, that's terrifying. Trapped in a cabin with a game designer.
Grim Hollow Transformed. The second post-Kickstarter playtest packet will be dropping, I think, in a few hours.
Necessary. I don't think that Medusas being women was like a pressing issue of gender equality.
Shawn, do you think this is a good design choice to put legendary actions back into the game?
Yeah, no.
I don't care either way.
They're making changes to challenge rating. I'm interested.
Disagree.
Oh, okay.
Oh, Dael disagrees with Shawn.
D&D, I don't think inherently wants to say anything about femininity or women in society or those kind of cultural connotations. What they want is scary bog witch.
It's sort of leaping into the middle of the fray rather than being born from the fray.
You were merely molded by the fray.
All that and more right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms. That's right. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you should drop us a like right down below. Bam! Top of the show. If it is your first time here, though, maybe give it 10 minutes. See what you think. My name is Ben Byrne, and I am joined, as always, by Shawn Merwin, James Haig, Dael Kingsmill. And Dael, I'm going to ask, in the theme of what a lot of the news this week is going to be themed around, a monster from myth or fiction that you've not seen in an RPG before, but you would love to see run.
Okay. I know that the pressure's on me because I, for many years, was known for retelling stories from Greek mythology. But I swear to you, the only thing that keeps coming to mind that I haven't seen in a TTRPG is what's called a vegetable lamb, which is it's a plant that grows sheep. That's all it does. The sheep might be like magic. They might be like good for healing or something, but they also often die because they fall out off the plant too soon. It's much like a barnacle goose. I guess what I'm pitching is not a monster for fighting, but some other kind of, I don't know, like a thing that you can go and fetch, or maybe it has healing properties, or maybe you have to protect it because the stupid sheep are going to fall off the stupid plant. I don't know. All I can think of is the vegetable lamb.
The party was TPK'd by falling sheep.
They're like drop bears.
Drop bears is actually a pretty good call. James Haig, what about yourself? Is drop bears your answer?
I just said it. I just gave it right away. I'd love to see a drop bear show up. I was of the same mind with Dael, where it's like, I can't think of a lot of mythological creatures that haven't been mined for content already. I was going through like good local Native American stories, but honestly, even those we've kind of sifted through pretty thoroughly. So yeah, it gets really into cryptid territory now. Right? I'd love to see some fantasy cryptids. What is fantasy Bigfoot like in a world where there's already kind of, unusual humanoids and they're just a fact of life?
Do like a Three Billy Goats Gruff style story, but instead of a troll harassing goats, it's the goat man harassing trolls.
Love it. So I'm still waiting for this RPG to come. I backed the Kickstarter, but I'm wondering if we're going to see the Black Beast of from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I mean, the Black Beast ate Brother Maynard and all the followers, and only the knight survived because the animator suffered a fatal heart attack. So if the animator hadn't died, we don't know what the Black Beast could have done.
The players would not have been able to beat that monster if they hadn't ganged up and physically tied their DM to a chair.
Exactly. But Dael can help me on this one, because the two mythological creatures that came to mind were the Hecatoncheires, which I think would be amazing to fight something with 50 heads and 100 arms. Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to roll 50 spear attacks here. Hang on. And I've never seen the Undines used as a monster. I've seen similar water nymph kind of creatures, but I've never seen the specifically Undines used. From different areas, they have different sort of powers or different themes or different stories. Some say the Little Mermaid is based on the myth of the Undine being a water creature that has no soul, but once they marry, they marry with a human, and they gain a soul if they bear a child. So there's sorts of myths around that, but that cuts very close to the Kobold Press's 100 different women lying in
women in water.
Yeah,
Distributing swords. There we go. It all comes back to Monty Python.
Yeah, it comes back. Yeah.
When I started my YouTube channel and I was doing all the cartoons for the mythology videos, one of the earliest stories I did had them featured. And they're the 100-handed giants, for folks who don't know. And the detail that had to go into this stupid little cartoon to get so many hands. I just made it like his body was made of hands in different directions and different shapes. What a nightmare.
They did blow my mind when I learned about, I pronounce it hecatoncres. I'm sure I'm incorrect there, but that's just the way.
None of us are Greek. We're probably all doing it wrong.
I think I heard it from a YouTube video, but that was literally it. Like, I thought that I was pretty across Greek mythology, right? And then just out of nowhere, this new creature emerged, and I was like, what on earth are these? They sounded like something from a D&D campaign to me, honestly. Just in terms of somebody being like, I don't know, it's got 100 hands and 100 heads, and they're all screaming constantly in agony. I don't know if that last bit's part of the myth, but anyway.
Sorry, Cosmic Postman in chat did suggest a very cool little adventure idea, which is trying to make Tiddalik the frog laugh. That's just for the Aussies out there. Anyway.
I would love to see, this is a little bit of non-surprise for everyone, but basically the specific version of the monsters as they are presented in The Witcher. Again, surprises no one. I just love the monster design, but specifically the Leshen. I don't think I've seen a Leshen done in that way, where it's not a treant, it's not a dryad, it's kind of the spirit of the forest itself made manifest into an individual creature. Cobalt Press did do a version of the Leshy, which is a bit closer to the original Slavic myths, which are less monstrous, I suppose, and a little bit more kind of like forest spirity. But yeah, I would love to see a kind of like 100 skulls inside a tree stump that, is the spirit of people who died in the forest or something like that.
Hey, Ben, speaking of Leshy, I think you would get a kick out of a indie game. It's a video game called Inscription. It's about deck building and playing card games, and it's about a lot of stuff. But the beginning is you're kind of
spooky vibes.
Yeah, the beginning is you are trapped in a shack with a creepy dude called Leshy, who it forces you to play his handmade trading card game.
Ooh, Inscription is
Inscription
what it's
with a Y.
With a Y.
Yeah.
Wow, that's terrifying. Trapped in a cabin with a game designer.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Exactly.
That's it.
Woof. Come play my game again.
That's really what it is.
All right, everybody keep your eye out for Inscription. I'm not going to segue this next bit. We just wanted to do at the top of the news this week, obviously, what's on a lot of folks' minds is the fires that are currently raging in California. We just want to do a quick shout out. Obviously, there are folks within our industry that are affected, and a lot of folks outside of our industry that are affected by the fires. Our thoughts are with those people. Can't imagine the loss of just having everything you've known disappear. My understanding at time of recording, the fires are still ongoing, hoping that those can come under control as soon as possible. And yeah, as I say, thoughts with everybody who has been affected directly or indirectly by those. Just a quick bit of Ghostfire news, actually, for folks who backed Grim Hollow Transformed, the second post-Kickstarter playtest packet. It will have dropped if you're listening to this on YouTube. Also, decide if you want to drop that like now. We are releasing a transformation playtest packet. This time, it is the Lich, the Seraph, and the Aberrant Horror transformation that have been transformed from their original incarnations in the original campaign guide those three were from. I'm excited, Shawn, for your redesign of the Lich, particularly because it no longer has the massive gates, the massive prerequisites to get involved with the Lich.
The Lich was one of those things where it almost felt like a subclass rather than a transformation. It felt like this particular thing, if you were a caster, you definitely wanted it. And so we, in the Monster Grimoire, created the Memory Lich, which is a warrior Lich. And then I sort of tried to tweak another set of possible boons in the direction of religious casters of
Divine?
Thank you. Divine casters. It's got a bigger array of people that might be interested in using it rather than it just being a thing that, oh, cool, arcane casters, let's do this.
Well, I like that that's what's being brought to a lot of these transformations, right? Is that originally, I think even the Aberrant Horror and the Werewolf in particular really favored martial classes. Mm-hmm. It wasn't really useful if you were a spellcaster to become a werewolf, especially because it had those prerequisites of you need a constitution or a strength score of X. The Lich transformation transformation required you to be able to cast a 7th level spell, which I think meant that you had to be a full wizard of at least 13th level before you could even start the Lich transformation, which I fully understand plays into that idea of like only the most powerful spellcasters can even attempt this transformation. But it also meant that nobody got to play this transformation because statistically we know most games don't go above sort of level 13, 14. Whereas this provides a much wider variety of A, the transformation's actually accessible to anybody, and B, there's more, as you said, fantasies that can be fulfilled in terms of the undying warrior who will not fade until he is defeated. Or
Koschei the Deathless. Yes.
There you go. There you go. We've also got the Aberrant Horror in there. Has the Aberrant Horror changed massively? What are your thoughts on the Aberrant Horror, Shawn?
I just sort of looked at the powers and the drawbacks and just tried to sort of bring them all into some sort of focus with the rest of the transformations.
And then the Seraph, quite different from the others because the Seraph's not so monstrous. The Seraph is almost like that fantasy of you are a paladin, you are a, you don't have to play a paladin, but you are a person who is so holy, is such a paragon that the divine has chosen you to ascend to divinity yourself and so commence the Seraph transformation.
And there's still, though, this idea that by becoming so something other than mortal, that there are risks involved. There is still a soul to be lost. Despite you feeling holy and acting holy and even being holy, there's the other side of the rainbow that you could cross to if you're not careful.
There's a video game RPG I played when I was a little kid. One of my foundational fantasy experiences, a Japanese RPG called Tales of Symphonia. And it is not dark fantasy really by any means. It's very epic, very heroic. But one of the characters early on is undergoing this process of conditioning to become an angel. And she has this whole arc of trying to conceal from her allies that she is losing her 5 senses, all like her emotions, her sense of touch and taste and smell. And eventually one of the characters like pulls a trick on her with like a cup of hot coffee where it's like, have this hot coffee. And she's like, it's so warm. And he's like, I lied. It's actually cold. And she's like, haha, I was just joking with you. And he's like, no, I double lied. It was actually scalding hot. What is going on with you? And that's just such a great plot beat that transformation reminded me of that sort of loss of humanity in a divine golden way.
Yeah, there's definitely a tragedy in that, right? This call to a higher calling, but what do you sacrifice along the way? Because the transformations traditionally, and it's part of the tragedy for me of the transformation is that as written, I believe most of them, the vampire, the werewolf, the aberrant horror, they can't be removed by anything less than basically a wish spell. There is a cure for werewolfism, I believe is Fezeg blood, which is written into the Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire. So there are other little ways in there that different transformations can be cured, but the intention is like once you start becoming a monster, there's no way to kind of retread that path is kind of part of the thematic story. But for the Seraph as we've written it, you can just like give it up. As a soldier lays down their sword after a war is finished, you can give up your divinity and return to being mortal if you wish. You can't then just restart the transformation automatically is kind of the drawback. But I'm curious, does that track for you, Shawn, in terms of like, from a design point of view that it's so different in that way?
Well, we wanted to make each of them different. We didn't want there to be a template where every single one did the exact same thing. With a few of them, I tried to put that in there where it's something that you would want to do. It's not a curse per se. The cost may be too high. And at that point, you may need to say, no, story-wise or even mechanically, no more. I want to go back and embrace my mortality.
So that playtest packet is available for anybody who backed the Kickstarter. There will be a link somewhere. You can still get access to it by late pledging, and you get access to all the previous playtests we did was the subclasses, all 12 of the new subclasses for Grim Hollow.
Heritage system. Class, all
the heritage system, the new monster hunter, it is all there in our Discord as well. Speaking of monsters, quite a lot of information, interesting tidbits dropped about the new monster manual for us to feast upon for the next little bit, like ravenous monsters. The 2024 Monster Manual, they did a couple of videos on the Dungeons & Dragons YouTube channel with the designers. First little tidbit, which I'm, happy about. I don't think this was a secret. I don't think it's entirely new news. But there's multiple stat blocks for different monster types. Specifically, they shouted out the Cyclops as the Sentry, which is kind of the base Cyclops, and then the Oracle, which is a more magicized up kind of Cyclops. I think it's like a divine Cyclops. The Death Knight has 2 versions where there's a higher level version, which is the Death Knight as you know it, and then the Death Knight Aspirant, which they talked about being kind of the herald of a true Death Knight, but maybe an individual, a villain with ambitions of their own that could play as a Death Knight-like villain at lower levels, which as a GM, I always love having those options.
I love this as an approach because it does a couple things, in my opinion. First of all, it lets GMs know, looking through these monsters, seeing different stuff, it goes Cyclops. You might not be like super taken with the idea of a Cyclops, but if you've got, I don't know, like a divine Cyclops priestess or whatever, you start going, oh, that's kind of fun. Or you see a sentry, like you see these different kinds of these creatures. And the first thing it does, in my opinion, is tell them, oh, I can make it do other things. I don't have to run the stat block they've given me. Here I've got multiple examples of what that monster looks like. I could do that. You know what I mean? You see where the stat block stays the same and where it changes, and it gets those wheels turning in terms of homebrew stuff, which is where I live. So for me, that's really exciting in terms of like the next generation of GMs. But the other thing is that I think it does a really cool thing in terms of allowing you narrative play without having to do heaps of work. Like if you want a Death Knight in your game, but your party is level 3, that's always a little tricky because the story says this guy is really bad news, but you have to do a ton of work to make him not completely wipe out your party, that sort of thing. And so giving examples where it's like, here's the depowered version, which is, I mean, it feels a little bit in the legacy of 4E almost, where, you know, you could really scale up and down those stat blocks. That sort of a thing, I think, is going to be really helpful for GMs narratively speaking. So I'm kind of hyped about that.
Yeah, I can't find a single bad thing to say about more breadth of options in terms of level range. Just like we were talking about with player options, right? Most D&D campaigns don't get past such and such low level. And to lock off all the cool, really splashy, mythologically interesting monsters to, you know, CR10 or above, it feels like a lot of the book goes to waste. Or at least it requires the DM themselves to do a lot of legwork in order to kind of pare down those monsters' power level for their lower level party.
Or the opposite direction, which is like, I've been really disappointed with the 2014 Monster Manual in terms of certain stat blocks. I want to call out Dryads for being kind of like a bit meh. You know, even werewolves themselves were like CR3 or something, I think. So they were a bit meh. The Cyclops, you know, there were a lot of like Ogre, Cyclops, other lesser giant, Etten maybe, that were all fundamentally just kind of the same, and nothing about them made them feel entirely distinct. I guess they did kind of have a few features, like the Etten had resistance to being charmed because it had 2 heads or whatever. So having higher level versions of some monsters means that you get those flavorful versions of a monster that you might not have at the lower levels because it's too oppressive to a low level party.
The other thing is, if you've ever made a monster book, your friend is, let's do 3 versions of the goblin at 1/2, 3, and 5. Let's do 3 versions of a vampire. You've already got the art. You've already done the hard work of getting that shell. So filling in, as Dael said, filling in those. Let's just do some tweaks there. The other thing is, these monsters tell stories on their own. And if you don't have groups of them, you're running every combat as like solo. You're running every combat as the one Cyclops or a group of Cyclopes. So let's have these different versions that tell their own story when I put all of their essences together in the same encounter.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I'm very, and this is the advice that I often give in the Formidable videos, is like, don't just like throw a monster in. Think why you want to use that specific monster in this specific encounter and what that says about the world, the experience you want your players to be having, the themes you want them to be grappling with. Having multiple monster stat blocks means that if you want multiple monsters in an encounter, multiple monster stat blocks of the same type of creature, I should clarify, means that you don't have to create a menagerie of monsters to create an interesting encounter. If you've got, you know, a couple of goblins and then one of them has a different ability, and then you've got a captain and then maybe a warg or something, but you don't need to feel like it's either all goblins or it's goblins and then for some reason there's a werewolf among them, you know, to try to make it interesting. So I love having groups of monsters that tie together thematically that help you build interesting encounters.
It's not even important. I was just enthusiastically agreeing with what you were saying, because it's like, rather than just throwing in a cave troll to this goblin encounter, you're in the Mines of Moria. When the cave troll is brought out, it's chained up, it's being dragged by goblins. It tells you a little bit more of that story. And you're right, that this just gives you more tools for sort of making that a little bit easy.
Which they talk about in the artwork. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but it's relevant because they've put quite a lot of lip service to the artwork. That was maybe an unkind turn of phrase, but it looks great. The way that they've talked about it is that they've very much gone away from the character art that they did in the 2014 Monster Manual, where it's just kind of an isolated PNG, if you will, of a monster on a page, and made sure that every monster is kind of represented in a scene. And part of those scenes is some monsters appear in the artwork of other monsters, demonstrating that like a Death Knight may have a retinue of, I think they use the Death Knight aspirant as the example, but skeletons appear in other undead artwork and goblins might appear in a troll's artwork. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm just kind of saying how they try to link the monsters and really give GMs ideas and inspiration for how to create encounters, which is great.
I'm eager to see, because I don't know that they will. I feel like the 2014 Monster Manual had a real kind of disconnect between the narrative you're given, the art you're given, and the stat block you're given. Not entirely, it wasn't 100%, but it'll say, I'm trying to think of what the text is next to the Displacer Beast, because I remember scribbling lots of notes in the margins about how the narrative is like, oh, these deadly creatures, and they're always in pairs, and and it's used for this and that, and none of it was represented in the stat block, and the picture was a solo Displacer Beast. I was like, so what's happening here? What happened here? We need more communication.
It's interesting you bring up their pair hunting, Dael, because the artwork for the Displacer Beast shows a pair of Displacer Beasts, but one of them is the displacement.
Yeah.
That's why they think they're always in pairs, but there's really only just
they're actually not. They're actually solo hunters. Yeah. When I did my Displacer Beast, I was like, they should be pack hunters. So what is the truth? Who knows?
You think the pack's twice as large. You're like, oh, geez. Yeah. They have returned legendary actions into the monster stat blocks. We saw a preview from last year of, I believe, the adult or ancient green dragon, which took out legendary actions and just kind of put everything into reactions. The monster had some sort of statement around like, can take reactions, multiple reactions a turn or something, and could take more in its lair. Shawn, do you think this is a good design choice to put legendary actions back into the game?
For me, it's one or the other. It's the same thing. It's what can a monster do to make itself different than what a typical creature can do. Not different from what the characters can do, because the characters can do all those things anyway. Right? The characters get their own legendary actions. They're called bonus actions and they're called reactions. Wherever you put it, it's the same thing. And I like to see a game master have the ability to use their initiative and their storytelling in concert with the rules. So I do like to see those, yes.
I disagree.
Oh, okay.
Oh, Dael disagrees with Shawn. Oh, I mean, only barely. You'll see that it's the skin of disagreeing. No, I'm just a big proponent of legendary reactions or something along the lines of legendary reactions rather than legendary action. I think they're all basically the same idea with very slight variations in implementation. But the reason that I like reactions is because for me, the way that I implement them as reactions is that it's always specifically triggered by something that the players have done. My dragons will have a thing where it's like, if a character targets them with a spell, they can, as a legendary reaction, roar, and it covers the verbal component and it acts like a counterspell. That kind of a thing, where it's like specific to a thing that a player might do. And you can only do each of those things once, but there's no limit on how many you do in a round, that sort of thing. I like it feeling like it is part of the combat rather than feeling like its own separate thing, which I think the way that legendary actions have been implemented up until now feels like kind of its own thing, sort of leaping into the middle of the fray rather than being born from the fray, if that makes sense.
You were merely molded by the fray. You adopted the fray.
Yeah, what happens though when you have a party full of half-orc barbarians who don't cast spells?
Yeah, that's
well, then that's fine, because the dragon also has reactions that are based on getting hit by a melee weapon. You know what I mean? Like I've got a stack of different ones that it can do.
I take Shawn's point though, is I like, as the GM, the flexibility to be able to kind of implement different features depending on what's happening. I wonder if creatures will have legendary actions and reactions that kind of trigger in specific ways.
Well, I should say as well, not to be a dissing Diana. Seriously, that's a thing. Don't question it. Don't look it up. Not to be a dissing Diana, but I suspect I wouldn't be happy with the way Wizards of the Coast would implement legendary reactions anyway. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like this is just one of those zones where I live in my own personal bubble of how I run the game and how I homebrew. And so I don't think that, a widespread implementation would match my exacting standards regardless.
To answer Elpeggio in the chat, I believe they did say legendary resistances are still part of the game. And reading between the lines a little bit, they talked about how in a monster's lair, that monster will have access to more legendary actions and more legendary resistances, more uses of it in its lair. And then they talked about, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, how to make dragon stat blocks feel more flavorful and individualized between the different dragon types, they took some lair actions and made them legendary actions for those dragons instead, which I'm kind of like, great, love that for the dragon. But it makes me wonder, those two statements taken together, did they get rid of lair actions as their own thing and have just made them legendary actions that the monster gets more of within its lair? I don't know that for sure at the moment, but just reading between the lines a little bit. And I don't know how I'd feel about that. I'd like there still to be regional effects at least to give GMs ideas of things that could happen near a monster's lair to make the story more flavorful.
The regional effects are one of my favorite things of the original 2014 Monster Manual. I hope we don't lose that one.
Oh, man, something that the History Prof just said in chat made me think of this. This is not relevant. I apologize. But I finally went and watched The Secret Level for DnD. That was sick. That was so good. Right. We were cheering. My favorites of the set were Pac-Man and D&D. They were so good. Oh, my gosh.
I think I have to agree. I don't think I loved many of the others. They weren't bad, but I didn't love them.
Yeah,
and Ben's got to bring the mood down.
Well, speaking of bringing the mood down, the new Monster Manual has true alphabetization. Dragons and devils no longer grouped together as the example, but spread throughout. So a pit fiend is under P and a green dragon is under G. And that's okay in my estimation. I don't think they said this explicitly, but they alluded to there would be indexes that would group creatures more together by their type or their subtype or whatever. Look, what I'm actually worried about is the humanoid stat blocks. I really enjoyed having a mini NPC monster manual at the back of the 2014 monster manual instead of them being kind of spread throughout the entire monster manual like they were in Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse. I think what they're doing is probably makes the most sense of true alphabetization.
Well, I just think it's one of those things where there's no absolute correct answer. So I have to assume they've done a bunch of surveys and market research on their end to be like, this one is marginally better. I don't know, 46% of people prefer this one. And so we're going to, I don't know, something like that. Because I don't think there is a wrong answer, but I don't think there's a right answer either.
Yeah. D&D is so focused on its multiverse right now, it does seem like an odd decision for demons and devils in particular, split them up. But I've also noticed that in terms of broad alphabetization, I'm trying to think back, right? Because there was something in my mind regarding spells in the player's handbook that touched on a similar issue. There at least was a big debate about different ways to classify the spells. It never made it into any of the playtesting, I don't think, but a lot of people talked about, well, we should have all of the spells broken down by level and then alphabetized within their spell level. That was pretty strongly rebuked just because it's a searchability issue, right? If you want to cast, let's say, Death Ward, and you don't remember if Death Ward is a 3rd, 4th, or 5th level spell, then all of a sudden you've made yourself work a lot harder because you now need to use a more esoteric classification system than just what letter does it start with.
It's are we browsing or are we looking up? You know what I mean? But I suppose if we're including an index anyway, that's the power of an index. You can format the book for browsing purposes and then also have an index where people can just jump straight to the page number. And maybe that's what they're shooting for.
And for fairness, D&D has never really had good indexes, but I think the new Player's Handbook's index is a cut above what's come before. I still wouldn't call it my favorite index of all time, but it's a lot better. It's a lot better.
What would you call your favorite index of all time?
Well, you know me. I keep a list. I have no idea. A lot of academic textbooks have pretty good indexes. I would say
Handbook of Greek Mythology, great index.
There you go.
This is the skin of disagreement with Dael about how they've laid out this book. But I think that they've laid it out for referencing, not for browsing, which is kind of the inverse of what you said. Because browsing is, let me go have a look at some devils and then flick through the devils and kind of see them all grouped together. Whereas if you can find all the devils together in the index, that's great, but you kind of have to know what those stat blocks all do.
Yeah.
To get use out of that index. Otherwise, it's a lot of flicking back and forth to see like, well, what does this devil do? Okay, now what does this devil do? As opposed to just like perusing.
I actually completely agree with that. I think that this monster manual, it sounds like if it's going to be in alphabetical order, that is a referencing format. Whereas if you were to group spells by level and then alphabetize within level, I think that is for browsing purposes, because that feels like it's player facing and it's, hey, here's all the spells you can have all in one place. You are choosing one of these spells now, which feels like a very different thing.
Yeah, no. I was going to bring it up, but it doesn't really matter. When I saw it in Monsters of the Multiverse, I was like, huh, but I think I'm just through exposure kind of softening to the idea now. I can see the benefits of it more than I can get that sort of like knee-jerk reaction.
For old school gamers of D&D, it's just going to take a bit of getting used to, because it's always been, here's the dragons, here's the devils, here's the demons, here's the giants. And I don't care either way, but I find myself going, no, okay.
And, this is one in, I think, a long series of changes that I think will actually make the game more accessible to new players, right? If I want to bust out a Neakaloth, and I don't know that's under Yugoloth for Y, then I'm in some real trouble. If I want to bust out a Pit Fiend, but I can't remember if it's a demon or a devil, I guess they're both under D. You can just kind of flip through D. But
they made the very good point in the video that their mindset was that they didn't want anybody to have to be so much of a fan of D&D to know that gelatinous cube was under O for ooze.
I didn't know that.
Well, there you go.
I would have gone to G.
But I wonder, like, is this going to be so alphabetized that all the young dragons are together? Or is young green dragon still going to be under green dragon? In which case, it's not true alphabetization. Just saying.
Unless it's green dragon, comma young, then you're doing just fine.
I think that's how Kobold Press do it. I think they, in their books, they sometimes have the monster name like back to front with a comma to kind of be like, oh yeah, it's a Rakshasa, but it's Rakshasa Ancient or something like that.
Look, as much respect as I have for the Dewey Decimal System, okay, sometimes the method of organization that feels correct in your heart is a little bit messy, okay? One day, my mom and I decided to reorganize the whole family's DVD collection, and we started out doing alphabetical. That's a nightmare. Accurate alphabetical? No. Just all the A's generally together. And then we were like, oh, but we do have a lot of different Austen movies. So maybe Pride and Prejudice goes under A, because if you're just generally looking for an Austen film, you go to the A section and you choose from there. And you can figure that out. The Shakespeares, they all go under S. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes you just got to vibe it out. But the other bonnet dramas don't go under A. No, they're different.
That's under B. For bottom. Yeah. I'm looking for all libraries to just jettison the Dewey Decimal System for the Kingsmill system.
I think they should.
But only for DVD collections.
When I was working at EB Games, the one thing you could rely on was the discs in the drawer were fully alphabetized, fully alphabetized to the title of the game. The problem was it just meant that the T section was massive because you had to flick through a billion ths to be able to get to
that's bad alphabetization. The does not count in your alphabetic count.
Does A count? As in the word A?
Yes, I think A is less common than the.
Remember?
Yeah.
Speaking of grouping monsters, they've changed the type of a couple of monsters. Quick pop quiz, Dael Kingsmill, what were kobolds? What creature type were they in 2014?
I couldn't tell you the creature types if I had a gun to my head. Not even just kobolds, most creatures.
Give you a clue. It was humanoids.
Okay. I hate that.
Shawn Merwin, what were goblins in 2014?
I would say also humanoids.
They were humanoids. James Hake, what were gnolls in 2014?
Sure were humanoids.
Were they monstrosities? No, I think they were humanoids. Anyway, the answer is humanoids for all three. They have now been changed to kobolds are dragons, officially. You know, mythology buffs cried, but D&D fans rejoiced. Goblins are now fae. D&D fans cried, but mythology buffs rejoiced. And gnolls are now fiends, which seems suitable. They're pretty horrible and fiend adjacent.
I think there's pretty strong lore
the
justification for all of these. And it goes back to the Mordenkainen books, where these creature types now reflect their origin. Though I think if we were to follow this line of logic more thoroughly, then gnomes and elves would be fae as well. And I don't think they're going to do that. But yeah, you know, gnolls are creations of a demon lord, so it makes sense they would be fiends. Goblins and their ilk hail from the Feywild before they got sort of hijacked by Maglubiet and his cult of Acheron and stuff like that. But, you know, I think we all know the real thing here is it's a push towards more fantasticality. It's a push towards keeping humanoids out of the monster manual, essentially.
I love this change, honestly. When I heard the goblins were fae, like way back, I think they made that change originally in like the Strixhaven was the college.
Wild Beyond the Witchlight?
Wild Beyond the Witchlight. I think they talked about goblins being fae in that book, if I'm not mistaken.
That rings a bell.
And originally I was like, but then the mythology buff in me kind of went like, actually, it probably makes sense. You know what? I'm cool with it.
There's a poem called The Goblin Market. Who's it by?
Christina Rossetti.
Christina Rossetti, not Mary at all. Thank you, Shawn. But yeah, I think for anyone who struggles with Goblin as fae, that poem to me screams Goblin as fae because it's very Goblin and it's very fae. It's not too long. Go read it.
This is also an absolute boon, I'm just going to say, for the Monster Hunter, the class from Grimhollow, because it means that more creatures are classified into monster types. I'm crossing my fingers. Come on, werewolves, monstrosities. Just make it happen, because that would solve a lot of problems for us.
It's also a pretty big nerf to things like Charm Person and Hold Person, any spell that particularly affects humanoids. You gotta hold that goblin with a 5th level spell now, baby.
Let us move on to the deeper topics, although we've got less time, so maybe we blast through this a little bit. They're making changes to challenge rating, claiming that the methodology for calculating the challenge rating of a creature has changed to ensure monsters, quote, stay on their challenge rating throughout a combat encounter rather than having outweighted abilities that either make them far too strong or far too weak for what they're meant to be able to do. Certain monsters, shadows, I think famously kind of had really dangerous features that would make them far out punch their challenge rating.
The Banshee, man. The Banshee,
yeah, just dropped to 0. Yeah, I TPK'd a party with that once. They all woke up an hour later and were fine, mysteriously. What this new methodology is, though, is anybody's guess, because it's not published in the new DMG, so exactly how they're calculating this. Maybe it's in the Monster Manual.
The Wizards for the 2014 version had a formula for creating the strength of a monster, and certain conditions that it could apply or certain areas that it could affect with, say, area of effect spells would up the challenge rating in relation to the damage that it could do. What you would see is monsters that could stun or monsters that could paralyze were given a higher challenge rating, but really be unable to do damage. Sounds good in theory until you're there rolling dice and you're like, oh, okay, you're paralyzed. And now I attack and you take 2 points of damage, 3 points of damage, and 4 points of damage. And now you're not paralyzed anymore. Oh, next round, you're all paralyzed again. And what we saw were long fights that were of no threat. And so I think, strongly believe Wizards understood this even after a couple months of play. And now they're able to go in and say, okay, what really does affect a fight that we need to take into account?
I have something very interesting to talk about on this point. Did you notice in the Empyrean stat block that there's something very interesting going on in its attacks? First of all, its attacks automatically stun you when they hit. Second off, you can choose to pay 21 hit points to just not be stunned.
See, I love that.
Stun with no save, unless you pay extra HP to not take it. Very, very interesting. And I like it on multiple levels, right? One, I think it might always be better to just pay the HP cost and not be stunned. So, not a perfect solution. But I do like this trend of no save versus conditions, because it speeds up gameplay, especially at higher levels when conditions are getting thrown around all the time. Yeah, fewer saves, great thing, especially if there's another way to actively counteract them rather than passively counteract them in terms of just sort of buffing your save number. Someone in chat says, unless you only have 20 HP, that's Pat saying it. I disagree. Unless there's a penalty to getting knocked to 0, I think it's better to just be KO'd and get healing worded and still have your next turn.
Yeah,
unless they do a Baldur's Gate 3
true.
style where you lose your action once you get pulled back up, which I don't think they do.
I
think it's also quickly worth clarifying with Pat's question. I mean, maybe this is what he meant, but unless you only have 20 HP remaining, because a character who only has 20 HP around their max is not going to be fighting an Empyrean, right? Like they're intended for a high level encounter. So that's when it starts to become more of a choice for a character, is when their health is getting low. There might be other monsters in the encounter that might be doing damage as well. Mm-hmm. Should I just be stunned because my turn is next and I'll just get it out of the way and hope for the best? Or do I take the 20 damage because it's better to have a turn and then go, however they rationalize it.
And for what it's worth, that Empyrean has 2 attacks that auto stun on a hit. So that could be, 40 HP. That's a more significant chunk, especially to a high level character.
The reason that none of this will ever be an exact science is because there's a huge difference between these conditions if they're done by a creature you're fighting solo, or this condition done versus an Empyrean and 26 Cyclops.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if you're stunned and it's only the Empyrean you're fighting, you come back around if it only lasts 1 round, or if somebody can cast a spell on you that brings you back, you're back. If you get stunned and then 26 other monsters are about to go, I'll take the 21 hit points and not be stunned, right? Mm-hmm. So trying to quantify what a prone condition, what stunned means, differs greatly depending on that scenario.
As a longtime XCOM fan, I personally love being caught between a rock and a hard place when it comes to decision making, right? I think there's something psychological that's gone into this design where it's like, maybe it'll suck less to lose a turn if it's your choice to lose the turn, or if it's your choice how you lose the turn, what manner you lose the turn. It gives you a little bit more agency in that. Or maybe it'll still suck for most players, It's hard to say without running the encounter. But I think for me, that kind of design would make a difference in how I felt about what was going down. And it's interesting that you bring up, Shawn, the idea of like one bad guy versus a lot of bad guys, because this is actually design that I've been using for a million years when running big solo baddies.
Right.
But in the other direction is when players use their stuff that's going to lock up your big solo baddie. And it's not even my idea. I stole it from Reddit. Someone called it bite the bullet. And it's just a thing where instead of, it doesn't have to be a legendary resistance or anything like that. It's just instead of taking the stun from your monk or whatever, you lose a bunch of hit points. And in my experience, the players like that when it happens to the baddie, because they at least get something out of it versus legendary resistance where it's just kind of a slog whittling it away.
Is anyone else sad that it's an exact 21 hit points and not like 10d6 or something that's has a little bit of wiggle room? Because 21 hit points, now you're, I've got 23, so I can take the 21.
Sure.
But if it's 10d6, that's a whole different, maybe, I don't know.
I love that.
Yeah,
that's interesting because I
Are you a gambling
look at the stat
man?
block directly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of gambling, man, I'm going to jump topic a little bit here because we need something for the thumbnail. So one announcement that they made that they're patting themselves on the back about is the artwork now depicts, generally speaking, different types of certain monsters. They've kind of mixed up the gender of different monsters that have traditionally been inherently associated with one or the other gender, usually female, honestly. The examples they've shown are hag, dryad, Medusa, all have male versions of those monsters shown in the artwork. The satyr, which I guess is traditionally male. Dael, you might have more insight into that. They're showing a female version. The succubus incubus is an interesting one. Traditionally in mythology, succubus being female, incubus being male. Now there's a male and female version of both succubus and incubus. And they can, we learned this earlier in an adventure they put out, I think. They can swap the creature can change into a succubus or an incubus and go both ways.
That what I find really amusing because, and I could just be wrong on this, but it's my understanding that an incubus is just the male version of a succubus and a succubus is the female version of incubus. And they did have different, like the lore surrounding them was colored by, gendered tropes, but I think it's really funny to just be like, nope, they're just like fully distinct things, and there are males and females of both. It's not a bad thing. I'm not offended by this change in any way. I'm not like wowed by, I don't think it was like super necessary. I don't think that Medusas being women was like a pressing issue of gender equality, but I'm not mad about the change. It's like, okay.
I like the distinction they've made with succubus and incubus specifically, that one is in the material realm and attacks you physically, and one is in the ethereal realm and attacks you more kind of
the
psychically.
incubus haunts your dreams.
I agree with you, Dael, that like I'm certainly not offended by this change. I think it's fine, and I think it's good to open up that possibility for GMs to kind of realize like, oh, I could create like, you know, a person of the woods who is male, like a wizard of the woods instead of a witch of the woods kind of trope. For me, it comes down to like theme and what those monsters represent through the mythology and what those monsters represent about human anxiety.
Yes. Yes.
And usually those things are fairly prejudiced against one or the other gender in that fear, right? The fear of a woman who is out of control, who we cannot, you know, master, who is her own free person. I guess just for my part, when playing with that trope or subverting it, I'd prefer a more like uncaged anthology approach where you play into the themes rather than just trying to pretend like they don't exist. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, hag is probably the one that for me stands out the most. And you and I had a conversation at some point when you were doing your formidable witches or formidable hags,
formidable
or whatever,
hags,
where we were talking about how it is an extremely, it is in particular so deeply about the anxieties around women and women's roles. It is a hovel in the middle of the woods. It's meant to be a symbol of safety in this dangerous place. The woods are dangerous. Here's a symbol of safety, a house, but actually it's a hag's hut. Oh, dangerous. And she's meant to be someone who cooks and cleans, but actually she uses her broom for flying, and she uses her cauldron for making evil potions. And she's meant to look after children, but instead she cooks them and eats them. Like it's all these things that are taking the depiction of what women should be, what femininity should be, and it makes it evil. And that's why she's evil. And so it is interesting to see it happen with a hag. And it is interesting to think about the implications that shift when the fear and anxiety attached to that type of monster gets flipped into the other gender spectrum.
Yeah.
It's very interesting on this topic, especially because my thought on it is when you're actually playing with those themes, right, there really is no issue. If you have something to say about the relationship between women and society that, you know, uses that story, then yeah, your hag should be all female. But the question here is, D&D, I don't think inherently wants to say anything about femininity or women in society or those kind of cultural connotations. What they want is scary bog witch. And when that is the level of literary depth that you're engaging on, yeah, it makes sense. You know, get rid of the gendered stuff. Doesn't make any sense to. Then it's weird and kind of stereotypical. And so I think for the kind of game D&D wants to be, this is the correct choice. But it would definitely not be the right choice for a game that had more literary aspirations.
You know what it makes me think of? This is slightly off, and I apologize again. But you know how cyclones are named, where you go alphabetically and you alternate male-female names, typically male, typically female, and then you get to the end and you swap them. So it's like Annabelle, Bruce, Christina, you know, and you do that thing. I only found out recently that that's super recent. Originally, they just all were named after women. And then in the 70s or something, people petitioned them and were like, can you please just stop naming the embodiment of chaos and destruction after women? Like, could we just like chill out a little bit? And they said, no. And then a bunch of stuff happened. They were like, yeah, okay. So that's what that makes me think of.
I like that the compromise though was like, okay, but it has to be alternating. So it's fair.
What's the D&D supplement that Ashley Warren led on the DM's Guild, where it took these female stereotypical monsters and did a twist on them, and they did several. Uncaged, thank you. If you want some interesting takes on that, check out Uncaged and all the supplements that came after it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a couple of volumes of that now, isn't
There's
there?
four
at
uncaged
least
and
four,
then
yeah.
uncaged goddesses afterward,
go.
which I think is the best of
Right.
the lot. Uncaged goddesses is real cool.
How do we like the artwork?
Gorgeous. It's gorgeous, darling.
Great. All right. Solved it. Well, that's all we have time for. No, I'm just kidding. They talked about, and I think you can see this in the art that they've shown, how the monster artwork is now meant to represent the vibe of those monsters or the monster type more. So if you look at the undead art, it's very gothic and very spooky. And I think they're right. The undead art they've shown is very cool, very gothic, very spooky. Whereas using the Gith is my example, that artwork looks much more dreamlike and kind of astral and very Starsy. Fiends, they talk about being horror, but from a more sort of 80s metal band style of horror, I suppose. Whereas the dragon and giant art looks very high fantasy, very grand, kind of, formidable and scary in its own way, but not pulling into horror tropes as much as, I suppose, just scary because it looks like a dangerous animal, so to speak.
I particularly adore the art for the demons that we've seen. Like, I think it was, I don't remember which one it is. It might be the Hezru, something like that. But all of these demons, and the Hezru is typically big, nasty frog. Like, that's its thing. It's a big frog. But when you look at that art, its skin is covered in little mouths and eyeballs and all sorts of these warped, chaotic bits of horror. And it's like, yes, that's the demons they were trying to, like in Out of the Abyss in 2018 or something. They were like, 2015. They were like looking at the demon lords. It's like looking at Cthulhu and you will have madness that afflicts you. And it's like the demons in the monster manual are scary, but I would not feel sort of Cthulhuian eldritch horror by looking upon them. This is more like that.
Thank you. I just made me think of when I was visiting my parents sometime between Christmas and New Year, and my mum was on her phone and she just went, oh, it's horrible. Ben posts all these horrible things. I always like them. Like, she was talking about the minis that you paint. She always thinks that they're so horrifying, but she always likes them anyway because she thinks you do a good job.
Aww.
No, I also wanted to say, I mean, I think it is a great approach to take to sort of these groupings of monsters to give the thematic vibe for them. I recently got to talk to Jason, the art director for MCDM, and he was talking about, it was really interesting to me, he was talking about not trying to have a consistent art style across the entirety of your book, but about sort of grouping things and going, maybe all your demons are done by this person, maybe all your goblinoids are done by this person, so that there's consistency within that makes the whole thing feel coherent rather than trying to make everything look the same.
I particularly like the theming they've given each monster as well in trying to represent its personality and how the party might interact with it. The example that they use is comparing the green dragon artwork to the other types of dragons, where the red dragon's very brutal and very, flying down from the sky, and the white dragon, they say, looks like a predator and it's just like ripping something apart like a tiger would. Where there is the green dragon, and I think we saw one of these artworks earlier where it kind of looked like a giant cobra with its tail kind of coiled around the trees. They've shown another piece of art, which I think is absolutely gorgeous, but it tickles my brain in a particular way from other fantasy artwork I've seen over the years. And it's the party in a boat, and you're viewing them from like directly top down, and the water beneath them is kind of murky but has a clarity to it. And you can see beneath their tiny boat is the giant serpentine kind of shape of the green dragon, like danger so close, and they're so completely unaware of it that it just makes the monster seem so formidable and frightening in a very simple way that's not using like gore or spookiness to achieve that.
There are some art pieces that I don't particularly vibe with, but for the most part, I think this is the most beautiful monster manual we've seen in D&D ever. And I think it's nature of setting the monsters in scenes rather than having them be, as an art director might say, single figure, no background, as opposed to having it all be that with only a couple of scenes. That really sets it aside and it enhances the storytelling in a way that is really valuable.
Well, speaking of enhancing storytelling in a way that is really valuable, No, I got nothing. We need to end this podcast. If you haven't given it a like already on YouTube, then give it a like.
Now that's a cliffhanger.
Yeah, exactly. You'll need to come back next week because we will be here. If you want to hang out on Twitch, we're here 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Monday, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and it is 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, I suppose, on a Tuesday. So come hang out with us live. Otherwise, comments and all that stuff help us get out to more listeners. We really appreciate you being here. My name's been Ben Byrne, here with Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake. And we will be back next week for another episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. Ba-da-da-ba-da-da. Ba-da-da-ba-da.
We're back. We got it this time. We got it. Ba-ba-da-ba.